University of Alabama. And I also direct LACLS, the Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx Studies program, which is organizing and sponsoring this event. Let's see here. So I'd also like to thank Dr. Micah McKay for joining me, helping. We'll both be tracking the chat and tracking the Q&A later on so that we can help Dr. Petway receive your questions for him after his presentation. So what is LACLS, Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx Studies program at the University of Alabama? It's a program within ANS, and we organize events like the one you're at right now. Normally these happen in person, and we have catering and togetherness of all sorts. It's really fun. We also have a minor, which is available for undergraduates at the university. I'll do a quick screen share to show you our webpage. All right, this is LACLS, and you can check out our affiliated faculty up at the top here in one of the tabs, what courses count towards the minor, what events we are organizing, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so a lot of people have parts of the minor complete without realizing it, and they haven't signed up. So if this is an area of interest for you, we could talk about what courses you've already completed that would count towards that minor. What we're here to talk about today, though, is Dr. Matthew Petway, and especially his recent book titled Cuban Literature in the Age of Black Insurrection, Manzano, Placido, and Afro-Latino Religion. This came out at the end of 2019. So it's a very fresh book, and I'm just really delighted to have Dr. Petway with us today. So I will go ahead and introduce him, and then he can get started, because I know he's the one we want to hear today. So Matthew Petway is Assistant Professor of Spanish at the University of South Alabama, where he is associated with the Africana Studies program. His PhD is from Michigan State, and at South Alabama, he teaches Afro-Latin American, Caribbean, and Spanish literatures. He was a visiting scholar in the Lilas Benson Latin American Studies collection at the University of Texas in Austin in 2014. In 2013, the University of Kansas named him the Langston Hughes Visiting Professor. At Kansas, he offered a graduate seminar on Blacks in Cuban literature and delivered a public lecture on his research. He has also received the Foreign Language Area Studies Fellowship to study Brazilian Portuguese in Salvador da Bahia. That's great, I love that. Petway has a keen interest in how Afro-Latin Americans that endured extreme trauma in the colonial era took hold of the aesthetic and spiritual tools available to them to conceive a poetics of emancipation. His research examines race, slavery, and African ideas of spirit and cosmos in 19th century Black Cuban literature. His work is part of a broader project of literary and historical recovery, akin to what Toni Morrison has termed, and I quote, a kind of literary archaeology, end of quote. He has published peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and encyclopedia entries on Cuban writers of African descent, such as Juan Francisco Manzano, Placido, who we will be hearing about today, José del Carmen Díaz, and Ambrosio Echemendia. His first book, which we are going to learn about today, Cuban Literature in the Age of Black Insurrection, is part of the Caribbean Studies series of the University Press of Mississippi. So Petway has numerous peer-reviewed articles in both United States-based and Cuban academic journals. These are from 2012 up into the present, and I'll read a couple of titles to give you a sampling of his work. Ritual and Reason, Negotiating Freedom in the Literature of Juan Francisco Manzano. Also, Black Femininity and the Silence of Domestic Space in The Cemetery on the Sugar Plantation by José del Carmen Díaz. Also, let's see, Manzano en el Monte, recuperando el sujeto perdido en Un sueño a mi segundo hermano. And also, Páginas Salvadas de la Historia de Santiago de Cuba. Those latter two articles are in the Cuban journal del Caribe. Let's see, I'm going to skip ahead because he has so many accolades. I could go on all day. But let's see, he does have current work forthcoming titled Braggarts, Charlatans, and Curros, Black Cuban Masculinity and Humor in the Poetry of Gabriel de la Concepcion Valdez. That will be appearing in an anthology titled Breaking the Chains, Forging the Nation, the Afro-Cuban Fight for Freedom and Equality, 1812 to 1912, which is edited by Aisha Finch and Benny Rushing. And that will be out soon, I believe, with Louisiana State University Press. So Dr. Pettway is a native of Detroit, Michigan. His biography notes. I share your experience as a northerner in the South, right? South Alabama is just sort of down the street for those of us in Tuscaloosa, and we do hope you can visit in the future on campus so we can see more of you. As I close my introduction, I just wanted to mention why I'm personally so excited about hearing about his work more and meeting Dr. Pettway. I am also a scholar of 19th century Latin American literature, and so I know firsthand how much our field really needs his work, and I'm really happy to be reading it and sharing it with you all today. He opened up a new reading of these poets that we're learning about, and of a whole category of cultural production that we really need new tools to see in the archive and to interpret appropriately and accurately, right? I get the sense that there is a body of work out there that historically existed, but is so incredibly difficult to access today. In many cases, it's not possible, right? So you're teaching us how to read through that challenge and how to read through that archive. So with that, we cannot applaud audibly in Zoom, but I welcome you to the University of Alabama and LACL's webinar series. And thank you, Dr. Pettway, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
Should I say one final note? Pardon me,
yes.
I'm going to put your poems, the 2 sonnets, one in English and one the original Spanish, in the chat so people can follow you visually as you discuss them.
Absolutely.
Okay,
thank you. Thank you, Professor Sarah Moody. Special thanks to Professor Sarah Moody, Director of the Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx Studies Program at the University of Alabama. And thank you to Professor Micah McKay and to the Department of Modern Languages and Classics at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. I'm honored to be here today and to have the opportunity, virtually at least, to speak with you about my book, Cuban Literature in the Age of Black Insurrection, Manzano, Plácido, and Afro-Latino Religion. We inhabit an important historical juncture, a moment where the clamorous voices of authoritarianism turn rivals into nemeses, threaten the sanctity of the ballot box, and conflate fact with fiction. These acrimonious voices discredit the very notion of truth. Authoritarian leaders prophesy a democracy in ruins. They envision a society where the adversaries are silenced or even disappeared. And they labor tirelessly to build a world where the legitimacy of the leader is without dispute. We might think of the events of January the 6th in Washington, D.C. But I am interested in addressing the problem of authoritarian regimes by looking at colonial Havana rather than the United States in the early 21st century. We must reassess former slave societies in order to properly comprehend the rise of authoritarian regimes across the globe. Slave societies are not a relic of a bygone barbaric past. Slave societies are archaic authoritarian regimes that require little to no subterfuge to legitimate their exercise of power. They make no pretense to the universal individual rights so often acclaimed in liberal democratic societies, yet unattainable to their most vulnerable citizens. Slave societies die, but they do not decompose. And I'm thinking of the United States in 1865. I'm thinking of Cuba in 1886 and Brazil in 1888, the last 3 nations in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. Former slave societies forsake one framework of legitimacy for another. They substitute one technology of power for another, but the same articles of faith endure: a belief in racial hierarchy, the doctrine of white supremacy, and an unquenchable thirst for an exploitable and disposable labor force. In slave societies, silence is a staple of the rhetorical diet. Discourse is regarded as the privilege of a precious few. Social positions within slave societies are divinely ordained and are therefore justly deserved. Social and economic mobility between groups is not only rare, but inherently undesirable because a person's standing in life is divinely sanctioned. And we can see some of the results of that in a former slave society like Alabama, not only for people of African descent, certainly for people of African descent, but for economically disenfranchised people of European descent as well in a place like Alabama. Education is the luxury of a choice few in a slave society, and critical thinking is anathema to social cohesion. In slave societies, it is generally accepted that authority should not be questioned. And since people can be bought and sold, they are deemed inherently expendable. So I argue in part that we're dealing with some of the reverberations of being part of former slave society. And I believe that by looking at an author like Gabriel de la Concepcion Valdez, who might be thought of as a Cuban Martin Delaney type figure because he's born free, we might be endowed with the requisite power to defy authoritarianism today. Gabriel de la Concepcion Valdez was a 19th century African-descended Cuban writer, commonly known by the pseudonym Plácido. Plácido was the son of a Spanish woman and a man of African descent. His parents abandoned him to a Catholic orphanage due to the scandal surrounding his birth, but his father, Diego Ferrer Matoso, placed the child in the care of his Black grandmother, who raised him within Black Cuban communities. Now, Plácido was a person of African descent, but he was very light in complexion. He had a whitish complexion. He was considered al parecer blanco, or white in appearance at birth. Despite that, Plácido identified as a member of African-descended community, which became a political problem for him in certain quarters. The Spanish colonial government responded to the threat of Plácido by accusing him and his contemporary Juan Francisco Manzano of concocting, quote, a conspiracy devised by the people of color to exterminate the white population of this island, end quote. The Spanish government claimed that Plácido and his co-conspirators had engaged two political methods in their racially charged scheme, quote, a poetics alluding to plans contrary to the tranquility and security of the island, end quote, and Plácido's oath. It's Plácido's oath that we want to talk about today as a form of poetics. Now, Juan Francisco Manzano might be thought of as a Cuban Frederick Douglass, but he published his autobiography in 1840. So it might be more fair, and Douglass didn't publish his first autobiography until 1845. So it might be more fair to think of Douglass as an African-American or as an African-American Manzano of sorts. I want to discuss briefly how Cuba became a slave society, and then I have a couple of analytical questions I want to pose before actually getting into the talk today, which will be about the oath as a sacred speech act, as a way of confronting empire, as a way of building solidarity among the enslaved, or even oppressed people today. Cuba becomes a slave society in the shadow of the Haitian Revolution between 1801 and 1850. The Atlantic slave trade brings approximately 547,000 African captives to Cuba. 547,000 African captives to Cuba. That's an astounding number of dislocated people. It exceeded the volume of any other place in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere, except one country, Brazil. The Atlantic slave trade, which by 1827 had already made Africans and their Cuban descendants the numeric majority of the island, presented a promise of wealth production for white planters, but also threatened the perpetuity of enslavement because the numbers were so great that they were similar to those in the island of Saint Domingue, which became Haiti in 1804 after the revolution, the only revolution by enslaved people to succeed. Though the ratio of Africans to Europeans and Africans to European descendants was much greater in Saint Domingue than in Cuba. I pose a series of questions today about a sonnet that Plácido published in 1840, notwithstanding the painstaking surveillance of Spanish censorship. My question first is for the audience. What did you learn from coming of age in a former slave society? Think about that. What did you learn about race? What did you learn about loyalties? What did you learn about knowledge? Was Africa a place of knowledge in your upbringing? And what might Plazo's sonnet, The Oath, en español el juramento, demonstrate about effective resistance to authoritarianism? How could an impoverished poet with no formal humanistic training, no military expertise to speak of, and no experience in the diplomatic corps pose a political threat to one of the greatest empires in the modern world? So I want to take a moment here to share my presentation. I'm going to go here to current slide. And here you have a cover of the book. I have two images I want to show today of Plácido as a way of introduction. And these are important because you'll look at them and you'll notice they look like two different people. The image on the right side of my screen is an image produced by one of Plazo's white allies, Sebastián Alfredo de Morales, who was a medical doctor who attempted to whiten Plácido in the imagination, Cuban imagination. Remember, Plazo was a person al parecer blanco, white in appearance. And the other image is called the Dubrac portrait, which is much closer to Plazo's actual appearance. So we know something about its actual appearance because we actually have descriptions of him. There was a debate about how close he was to whiteness. So the notion of race in Spanish America and in Brazil as well, and other parts of the Caribbean is different than notions in the United States. So instead of there being a black-white dichotomy, we actually had a gamut of colors and schemes. And proximity to whiteness was the imagined goal. So whiteness was still at the pinnacle in this problematic system, this white supremacist system in Latin America and in the Spanish Caribbean. But there was a sense of gradations that one could, if they married the right person, could get closer to whiteness. Plácido, in spite of his appearance, however, identified very strongly with people of African descent because he was raised by people of African descent. So let me share my central claim. The book itself analyzes African inspired spirituality as a subtext, as a subtext behind Catholicism. Catholicism then functions as camouflage for African inspired spirituality in Manzano and Plazo's work. But today I'm just talking about Plácido, and my central claim is that the oath deconstructed the edifice of authority that Cuban slave society relied upon. Spanish authority to enslave Africans was premised on the idea of white supremacy and on the Catholic mandate to proselytize non-Christian nations. But the military might of the Spanish Empire defended the right to enslave Africans and to perform compulsory religious conversions on them and on their descendants. Plazo's oath constituted a threat to Spanish colonial rule because it effectively broke faith with the Queen of Spain, number one, and number two, it dissolved the racial divide between Blacks and mulattoes. Plazo's oath threatened the holy trinity of slavery, religion, and profit with an I, because his poem alluded to an array of African Caribbean spiritual practices that questioned Catholicism and subverted its authority. So remember, there's no black-white divide in traditional Spanish American racial schemes. Rather, people of African descent were classified differently depending upon how light the skin was, the shape and slope of the nose, whether or not the hair was woolly or not. And so the oath, Plazo's oath, was frightening because it was a way for him to unite people of African descent across the board. So you had that question of solidarity. So the accusation of white genocide notwithstanding, Plazo's project was solidarity of people of African descent. Let's talk about a couple of terms before I actually get into the analysis of the poem. The first term and concept is cosmology. I'm going to cite here from Wyatt McGaffey, anthropologist Wyatt McGaffey, that cosmology is a certain concept of the universe and the place of man within it. So in this instance, he's using man to mean humankind, excuse me. We can think of cosmology as something similar to grammar rules for native speakers. So my students in Spanish oftentimes, if asked questions about why something is in English, can't explain it because it's presupposed to them. It's internalized. Cosmology is similar to that. It's codified in social practice. So you may have to touch wood before you leave the house, or you might have to do something else, but you don't necessarily know why you're doing it until sometime later that becomes evident to you. It's a little different than doctrine. Doctrine is taught explicitly. The word itself has a Greek cosmology, cosmos meaning universe and logos meaning reason, or the controlling principle in the universe. The controlling principle in the universe. So I argue in Cuban literature in the age of Black insurrection that both Manzano and Plácido were in touch with African cosmology, with those traditional African notions of the controlling principle in the universe, both Nigerian and West Central African. Nigerian and West Central African, particularly the Yoruba-speaking Nigerian ethnicities. But today we'll be talking about West Central Africa, the Congo Basin, or Congo River Basin, particularly a kingdom that no longer exists, but existed at one point, the Kingdom of Congo in northern Angola, what is today northern Angola. Its capital was Mbanza, Congo, and we'll see very briefly why that's significant. Prior to 1820, the greatest number of captives sent to Cuba came from West Central Africa. Manzano was born in 1797, the Cuban Frederick Douglass of sorts, and Plácido in 1809. So they're born in a period in which plurality of Africans being brought to Cuba against their will were being brought from West Central Africa. Bakongo cosmology in Cuba. How did it show up? In what form did it appear? Here's a map of the ancient Kingdom of Congo right here. Here's the Portuguese colony of Angola in 1575, established in 1575, which really served to destabilize the region further, which was the Portuguese plan. When we talk about the Bakongo cosmology places emphasis on the natural world. The natural world is a space replete with spirit presence. It's also a site for ritual practice. This forested wilderness is called El Monte in Spanish, in Cuban Spanish, El Monte. So El Monte in Spanish can refer to mountains or the hills, but in this instance, the way of referring to the forested wilderness, So the emphasis on the wilderness as sacred is going to be important to understand Plácido's poem, El Juramento, or the oath, because he names a series of nature metaphors, particularly the towering tree and the altar of hardened earth. So keep those two in mind. We'll talk about them briefly. From Flash of the Spirit, Robert Ferris Thompson explains the Cuban concept of the sacred wilderness, or El Monte. Quote, in Cuba, there the faithful honor the forest, El Monte, literally the mountain, as a source of healing power. They realize that its standing cathedral of shade and moistness belongs to Osayin and to God. And so they leave small sacrifices in payment of herbs and roots subtracted from his realm, for every tree, every shrub and herb, has its master and its protocol, end quote. Its master and its protocol. The protocol also is important. So when one enters into the sacred wilderness, if they're practicing an African-inspired tradition, the understanding is that there's a protocol to follow. You can't just go in and start cutting down trees. This is very, very important. The last source I want to cite with regard to notions of Congolese cosmology or Bakongo cosmology. The Bakongo were the group, the African ethnic group speaking Kikongo that was brought from the Kingdom of the Congo from the, we would say the 1500s on. This is the last quote from this, and then I want to talk briefly about the oath before talking about the poem. Lidia Cabrera's book, El Monte, his long polyphonic text, has some quotations from people who were either African or who were the children of Africans. And one of her informants said the following about the forested wilderness, or El Monte. So remember, the poem we're going to look at La Tierra Endurecida, or the altar of hardened earth, and the towering tree as examples of this sacred wilderness. We Blacks, quote, we Blacks go to the forested mountain wilderness as if it were a church, because it is filled with saints and the deceased, to ask for what we need for our health and business dealings. Now then, if one should be respectful in someone else's house, in the house of the saints, shouldn't one be even more reverent? So the question of reverence is important here. So I want us to imagine Plácido, especially if you have the poem available to you in the chat, thanks to Dr. Moody. If you have it available to you, to think of Plácido as being reverent, as thinking about the governing structure, not only of the universe, but of the sacred wilderness. Quote, the forested wilderness has its governing structure, la ley. En español se dice nada más la ley. It is necessary to know how to enter the forested wilderness, end quote. I briefly show you this image of Mbanza, Congo, which is the capital city of the Kingdom of the Congo. I like to show this to my students just to give them an idea of an African capital city. This is really still prior to the fall of the kingdom. And you can see here the Congolese Navy and the Congolese carrying on their business. This is the king's residence, the Bansa. But this is significant because in Congolese cosmology, the world of the dead is below a mountain. The river is essentially the barrier between the world of the living, which is above the mountain, and the world of the dead, which is beneath. So even the construction of the capital city for the Kingdom of the Congo was not accidental. It was not without a cosmological or spiritual reason, right? And here's an image of the forested wilderness in Cuba. This is a photograph that I took in 2012 when I was a professor up north. And you can see that bird, so you get an idea that falling from those heights means that you are about to enter into the land of the dead. You cannot survive that fall. You would enter into Impimba, to be sure. So Plácido's writing about a space, something similar to this when you're talking about El Monte. Now, with regard to the oath as a sacred speech act, I want to point out that Giorgio Agamben writes that oaths inhabit the intersection between religion and politics. So not only do we have El Monte represented in the poem, I argue, but we also have the oath itself. And it's not simply a promise between a number of people who are disgusted with the queen or want the queen to be eliminated, but people who are essentially disturbing the social order. The oath constitutes a social and political covenant between diverse interlocutors within a given polity. Agamben writes that the oath is, quote, the originary performative experience of the word, end quote. And political crises arise when either party disregards or dishonors the oath they have sworn. Plácido, of course, dishonors the oath he had sworn when he says in this poem that the queen should be executed. I'm going to read the poem in its English translation. And I have an image here of a hush harbor in the African-American tradition. So you can see these men of African descent speaking, negotiating, theorizing, and essentially making plans either to escape or in some other way challenge the system of white supremacy. Quote, in the shadow of a towering tree that stands at the end of an ample valley, there is a fount that bids you drink its pure and silvery water. There I went by my duty called, and making an altar of the hardened earth, before the sacred code of life, my hands extended, I have sworn an oath. To be the eternal enemy of the tyrant, if it is possible to tarnish my vestments with his detestable blood by my hand, shedding it with repeated blows, and dying at the hands of an executioner if need be to break the yoke. I want to place emphasis on these nature metaphors, the towering tree, the fount, and the altar of hardened earth. The fact that Plácido talks about an altar of hardened earth means essentially that he's talking about an altar that had to be made. The earth had to be beat. Something had to be done in order to create the altar. So the other significant thing here is that the altar in Catholicism is something very different. It's where the la hostia is, or the host is placed. In Catholicism, that's where the body of Christ is placed before communion. And Plácido here is talking about a cathedral somewhat similar to Lidia Cabrera's El Monte, so that El Monte becomes the tabernacle, an African tabernacle in this instance. There is no presence of the Catholic priest. He is not even expelled, he's irrelevant. The altar is hardened earth because it has been, I won't say so much tampered with, but it's been worked, right? Ritual has taken place. That's the implication. And we know that because he talks about his duty and then a sacred code of life, some sort of commitment that he's making. And we find out what that commitment is towards the end of the poem. He says he wants to shed with repeated blows, and he wants to die at the hands of an executioner, if necessary, to break the yoke. Slavery in this instance is a reference, is that yoke. Let's go a little bit further here. We're going to talk about the towering tree. There's two trees we can keep in mind and that are common in the Cuban environment. Cuba does not have the baobab, as you will find in Nigeria, or as I saw in Ghana when I went to Ghana. Son increíbles, esos árboles son increíbles. They're incredible. But it does have the ceiba tree, and it also has the royal palm tree. Both of those trees are significant in African-inspired traditions in Cuba. So I present you with one such tree, a towering tree. This is an example of the sacred ceiba tree. So in Cuba, even in a place like Havana, it's not uncommon to find coconuts under the tree and some other religious articles in a tradition, Yoruba-inspired tradition, with the emphasis on the tree then is a sacred space where people come to commune with spirits. So that's to give you an idea of what that tree might have looked like in Placido's imagination. He leaves it up to us to think it through. Now, in order to understand a bit more why the big fuss about a sonnet written by an individual who had no army. Now, he did recruit people into this anti-slavery movement. He did administer the oath. We don't have time to get into the specifics of that, I don't think. But he did more than incite. He actually administered the oath to individuals. And that shows up throughout the record. But he didn't have an army per se, and they never acquired the arms necessary to carry out the revolution. But let's take a look at the Spanish Catholic Church's ideas about superstition. Today we think of that as a song by Stevie Wonder, but superstition actually was considered a threat to the divine authority of the Spanish Catholic Church in Cuba. So in a book called Cartas al Impide, published in 1838 from Father Felix Varela's exile in the United States, Varela warned that superstitious individuals sought to, quote, erect themselves as oracles, perhaps to abuse true authority to the point of mocking it or attributing to it, as false prophets would, maxims and deeds that divine authority detests and condemns. So I want us to think again about the accusation made against Gabriel de la Concepcion Valdez, our Martin Delaney type figure, our Plácido. Plácido was so important that Delaney actually wrote about Plácido in one of his novels, his novel Blake, after Plácido had passed. A novel he starts to publish shortly before the Civil War here in the United States. But though Plácido was accused of wanting to to exterminate the white population, it appears a real threat was that Plácido functioned as an oracle, that he was an architect of discourse, and that his emancipatory discourse, his emancipatory talk and language wasn't premised on Catholicism or the notion of Christian redemption, that Jesus will fix it, essentially, but was premised on African religious knowledge, which argued that one can take revenge if need be, that violent revolution is justifiable in the tradition of the Haitian Revolution. It appears that this was the real problem. So I want to move towards the end here in the presentation. I'll end with a look at the testimony against Plácido. And then I want to open it up for questions so that we have enough time to dig in, hopefully more into the material. Sometimes the Q&A is one of the more exciting periods for author and for all of those gathered. So a Black Cuban coachman, this is one example of many of the testimonies brought against Plácido. Plácido was accused with regard to the leadership of this anti-slavery movement. We call it now the 1844 anti-slavery movement, but historian Robert Paquette and some others called it La Escalera, or the ladder conspiracy, because people of African descent were tied to ladders and they were tortured on those ladders. So your body's entirely exposed, you are unclothed, and you are being tortured by the state in order to, the Spanish were very good at torture. They developed waterboarding. A Black Cuban coachman by the name Jose de la O Garcia testified, quote, that he received the oath from Plácido, the poet, who called the attendees one by one and asking them to make the sign of the cross with the right hand, they swore to do as described above. This being concluded, they withdrew, Plasso charging them to gather together as little as possible so as not to become suspicious. What I've sought to demonstrate today is that Gabriel de la Concepción Valdez was a threat to the Spanish colonial government because he became an oracle, an architect of discourse, taking some of the most common symbols of Spanish Catholicism and turning them to the purposes of Black revolution. Thank you.
Wow, marvelous, thank you. So attendees, you can see the poems over in the chat on your right, and you can post questions or comments in the Q&A area. And I'm gonna change our view to gallery. Apparently that only allows us to see the panelists. I wish we could see more of the audience. I apologize about that. But down below, you probably have a Q&A area, and that is where you would post questions. If anybody has trouble with that, feel free to put them as well in the chat. That would be perfectly fine. Those are visible to everybody. I would maybe just get started while people are catching up, putting their questions in those areas by asking a little bit more about who Plácido was and what it meant to be a poet of color in Cuba at this time, right? If my understanding is correct, he was never enslaved.
That's right.
And in that he's different from Manzano, who I know a bit more about. So what does it mean to be a free poet of color in Havana at this time, right? Because there's also a big urban, rural, cultural division, right? So he's a Havana poet. And I think a lot of our audience might be hearing about him for the first time. So they might be interested in learning more.
That's right, yep. Manzano in the US is typically better known because it's easy to compare him to someone like Frederick Douglass. Plácido, like other free people of color or free people of African descent, would have been in a position where they enjoyed some of the benefits of not being held in chains. They couldn't be bought and sold. They couldn't be disposed of at will. And they also would have had the opportunity to practice different trades. So you had tailors, you had, for example, dentists that might go abroad to study depending upon their social rank. And the rare occasion you had some African descendants who would be considered mulatto. If we remember that we're not talking about the black-white racial dichotomy that comes to exist in the United States in the 19th century, that Saida Hartman writes about so well in one of her books. But some of those individuals, more wealthier individuals, would have even been plantation owners, and they would have owned other human beings. That was rare, but it did happen. But Plácido was indigent. Plácido didn't have means. He was not a person of means. Remember, he was orphaned by his mother, who was a Spanish woman from northern Spain, from Burgos. She wasn't from Andalusia. She wasn't from a place where there had been a large African Muslim influence. And she was looking to distance herself from this scandal with Plácido's father. And Plácido did maintain a relationship with her, but as a free person of color, he was without resources. He was educated up to the sixth grade. He had some African descended teachers. We know he had an African descended woman teacher, and this was not uncommon. There were that blacks would open schools. That was not uncommon. Free blacks in particular, even after Plácido's death in 1844. But what he would have dealt with in part was a challenge that there was no freedom of the press and no freedom of religion. And that really flies in the face of what Americanists are used to thinking about when they think about the United States, because, you had, at least pretensions to freedom of the press. And, David Walker was able to publish his Appeal in the early 19th century, right around the same time that Plácido was publishing. But Plácido had to use metaphor, like Manzano, and symbols in order to say what he wanted to say. And so that's why I get into this literary archaeology to uncover what he's saying. Another thing he would face, I'll say this to kind of wrap up, answer your question, is that people of African descent who were not enslaved had to carry paper.
Yeah.
So it's like papers, please. I'm reminded of the time when Barack Obama was asked, were you really born in the United States? I thought someone should write a paper called Papers, Please, Mr. President. Because of that whole notion that your legitimacy, your physical presence does not speak to your legitimacy. Your body actually speaks to your illegitimacy, and you are a threat. So the people of African descent, the free mulattoes and free blacks, were considered a threat because many of them could read and write, and they could come into contact with enslaved people, particularly those on plantations. And Placer did come into contact with those people, and later tried to say that he was simply there, to visit someone, and he had nothing to do with slaves, because why would a mulatto have anything to do with slaves and all of this? His testimony, which I deal with in the last chapter of the book, much of his testimony really is his undoing in a lot of ways, even though he meant to represent his position, his involvement in the 1844 conspiracy as that of a hapless pawn in the hands of powerful white interests. White interests were involved, but there was definitely an African descended character to the movement. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure if I'm audible still, but thank you.
We can hear you.
We have a comment in the chat from Harry Olufunwa, and he notes that there's an interesting convergence between Placido's the oath and certain Yoruba words, like the word for oath, which he says is imule, to swallow or drink the land, and betrayer, odale, betrayer, one who throws away the land. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
I actually am not. I don't speak Yoruba. I want to learn Yoruba. So this is really exciting. Thank you, Professor Olofunwa, for essentially sharing that with us. I think it'd be really exciting paper for someone to explore this whole notion of the oath through that Yoruba lens, right? So even when we think, for example, about the poem has several valences, even several African valences. I'm reading it through the West Central African or Congolese Bakongo-inspired lens, but one could also evidently read it through a Yoruba lens. And the tree is not identified. So the tree could either be the ceiba tree, or it could be the royal palm tree, which is important to the Abakwa, which are from the Cross River region. So thank you very much for that, Professor Olofunwa. If you'd be interested in writing something, I'd love to talk to you about it.
Wonderful, making connections. And we have a few questions also in the Q&A. I can read the first one here. Dustin Hicksenbaugh says, thank you. And he wonders if you could speak to Placido's interaction, if any, with writers and thinkers from places other than Cuba. He says that he knows some of the contemporary white writers complained about the quality of their education and access to non-Spanish writers.
Okay. What was the name of the panelist? I'm sorry, not the panelist, the individual that asked the question?
Dustin Hicksenbaugh.
Okay. Placido's connection to writers outside of the island, right? Off the island. Mm-hmm. That is a bit difficult. That's actually being explored now. I can tell you that posthumously, news of his work, I can tell you this for sure, news of his work spread to Spain while he was still alive in 1840. Some of his work was published by Jacinto Salas y Quiroga, a Spanish romantic author. That Spanish newspapers covered Placido, even his execution at the hands of the Spanish government was also covered. And a paper called El Laberinto. There's some new work, not my work, but someone else has work coming out that will be exploring Placido's influence in Spain, the way in which his legend lived on in Spain. And I can tell you as well that he was in so many different ways remembered by, what's the guy's name? Who published Blake, who published Blake, Martin Delaney. But I don't know of any communication with writers outside of Cuba. He never left the island. Neither he nor Manzano ever left the island. He had plans to leave the island, according to Manzano. plans to leave the island in order to be able to carry out the plot against the queen. But as far as we know, he never left the island. So I don't know of any direct connections between he and other writers.
Wow, he had plans to travel to meet the queen. So the oath is not
to meet
symbolic.
her. Yeah,
yes, to kill her.
It's not symbolic. He didn't plan to leave Cuba to kill the queen. He planned to travel throughout the Caribbean to gather support, according to one of my sources. Rather reliable sources, yeah, but not to go to Spain to kill the queen directly.
Okay, and so where my brain goes reading Dustin's question is to Domingo del Monte and his connections to the British abolitionists as one path we might have expected his work to circulate in internationally. But it sounds like that wasn't the case with him, in contrast with Manzano. So I'm curious about why.
Well, I write about in chapter 6 that the relationship, I framed the book essentially as a struggle between Manzano and Palacio and Del Monte's literary coterie. Instead of thinking of Manzano as necessarily being an extension of Del Monte's will, I see him as being Del Monte, essentially, for the audience, Del Monte asked Manzano to produce his slave narrative because he wanted testimonial literature that might be used to end the slave trade to Cuba, not necessarily abolish slavery, but the slave trade to Cuba. He was not an abolitionist. His family was slave owning, and they owned several enslaved people. So the wealth Del Monte was able to build by getting people to work for him and not paying them, essentially, was what made it possible for him to become one of the architects of early Cuban literary culture. Even though a lot of the novels that were published under his watchful eye were not published until after Cuba was able to publish and the freedom of the press came to exist, the Spanish granted freedom of the press. So Del Monte, yes, he did help Manzano's slave narrative get published. That slave narrative was translated into English, published in 1840, as I said before, 5 years prior to Douglas's first narrative. And it was also used at the Anti-Slavery Convention in London, and then another such convention in Paris, I believe it's 1842. But and Plácido's work is published in Spanish. Some of his work is published in Spanish in some of the newspapers posthumously, and some of his work is published in 1840, at the same time Manzano's work is being published, but in Spain by Salas y Quiroga. Del Monte's relationship to Plácido was very different. What he wanted Plácido to do was to leave, to incite rebellion, essentially, right? We're familiar with that word incite now, right? To incite rebellion, but he was hoping that Plácido could be utilized to do so, and then the white aristocracy would be able to, after the revolution started, would be able to take control of it and have an independent Cuba. And so Plácido, in that last chapter, I talk about the debate between the two, and Plácido really essentially excoriates Del Monte. So they had a falling out, and Plácido was clearly interested in anti-slavery insurrection, though he had no military training, but he didn't want to be a pawn of Del Monte.
Right. And in Manzano's case, his freedom resulted from Del Monte's influence in many ways. So he was more under his thumb, right?
That's right. I left that out.
And Plácido didn't have that circumstance where he was, beholden as much.
That's right.
That's great. We have another question in the Q&A. Thank you, Dr. Petway.
Absolutely.
So the next question in the Q&A is from Jonathan Rodriguez, and he says, Dr. Petway, how much of Plácido's knowledge of African-inspired spiritual beliefs comes from contact with enslaved and free people of African descent? Was he influenced from Haitian anti-slavery and independence in a similar fashion to the Aponte conspiracy in 1812?
The demonstrated relationship between Plácido and Haiti is very difficult. I do take that up in the book. One connection that I won't say it's tangential, it's not tangential, but that's possible connection is between he and a free mulatto or free African descendant known as Luis Gigo, spelled in Spanish oftentimes is J-I-G-O with an accent on the O, Higo, but Gigo, G-I-G-A-U-T. And according to the record, he traveled between, I think it was New Orleans and Havana. And he's believed to be of Haitian descent. He's believed to be of Haitian descent. Some of Plazo's other, he knew everybody. Luis Gigo knew everybody. The Spanish government was never able to capture him or to put him on trial. They may have tried him in absentia, like they did Del Monte, but they never able to put him on trial. So he evaded, not detection, but he evaded capture. And he was believed by the Spanish government to be the person of color that seduced, that was the word they used. They used the psychosexual language, seduced Plácido and some of the other freemen of color into the conspiracy. And I say once again, believed to be of Haitian descent. We don't know for sure. Robert Paquette dealt with that question. I believe Aisha Finch, her more recent wonderful book, I would also suggest her wonderful book. I think it's called Rewriting Slave Rebellion. She also deals with Gigo. But I have no testimony from Gigo, so it's a little difficult. We need some young scholars to get out there and look at some stuff, find some stuff on Luis Gigo, and to look at this question of the Yoruba meaning of the word oath, which is absolutely brilliant. So what I would say is that there's another possible connection with Plácido and Haiti comes through, I believe one of the, and you have to, don't quote me on this, go back to my book on this because I don't remember precisely, but I believe one of the accusers said that he had plans to travel to Haiti or to connect somehow with Haitians. But I don't make any definitive statements on it. In the book, I say clearly Manzano and Plaza were both involved in this movement, this anti-slavery movement, but to differing degrees. We don't know if Plaza administered the oath to Manzano and Manzano abjured the oath. We don't know. I think that's gonna make for a movie, to be honest. But with regard to his connection, to Plaza's connection to Haiti, it really remains to be seen. Yes, he was in the heart of the African descended community, and with regard to African people themselves, to Jonathan, I would say that we know that Plazo attended Carnival, and not the modern cleaned up Carnival that we have, these days, but Carnival where you had African drumming, where African confraternities or religious organizations run by Africans that preferred African leadership. He attended those types of meetings, and he wrote 3 poems or events in Matanzas, not so much in Havana, but in Matanzas. And he wrote 3 poems about those confraternities, those African confraternities or cabildos. They were called cabildos. I call those the cabildo poems. And he demonstrates knowledge of some of the internal logic of those organizations, as well as knowledge of one of the divine spirits, one of the orishas, to use a Yoruba word, that one of those particular cabildos revered. And that was the sister of the Shango warrior spirit called Dada. And so he says in his testimony, when he's defending himself against the claims that he was the leader of the anti-slavery movement, the 1844 movement, he says, number one, Del Monte is crazy. He's demented. Everyone knows that the Black people were pawns and the Black people can't stick together. He says that. And then he goes on to say, in addition to that, that I wasn't there anyway, because everybody knows I was at Carnival in Matanzas, because it was the time of the mask or las máscaras. He talks about presence at saints parties, saints feast days, Fiesta de Santos. So if you know anything about the Caribbean, the Fiesta de Santo Santo was another word, way of saying Orisha or African divine spirit. So there's a lot there. So that was my best way of answering that question. With regard to Haiti, we're not so sure about the specifics, but he was definitely embedded in these spiritual belief systems and practices.
Thank you. Let's see here. We do have a note from Jonathan Rodriguez that the title referenced was Rethinking Slave Rebellion in Cuba, La Escalera, and the Insurgencies of 1841 to 44, Aisha Finch.
Yes, wonderful book.
So thank you, Jonathan.
I have a question, Matthew. First of all, I really appreciated the presentation, and I especially was enthusiastic about the way that you carefully walked us through the Bakongo cosmology's views on the natural world, and how
thank you.
How Plácido folds that into this sonnet that is very that's making a really concrete commentary on a specific political moment. And I think that you walk us through that really nicely. And I so just wanted to let you know how much I appreciated that.
Thank you.
And I guess my question has to do with maybe the current standing of Plácido in literary study in Cuba. Do you have a sense of how he figures in with the teaching and study of literature in Cuba? Is he revered as a high point of 19th century Cuban literature? Is he little read? What's your sense of his place now?
I'm not sure how commonly he's read. I believe among critics, at least among Cuban literary critics, he's held in higher esteem than Manzano because he's considered a figure of resistance. Daisy Cuey Fernandez, one of my mentors in Cuba, actually published a book on Plácido, a wonderful book on Plácido called Plácido el Conspirador, Poeta Conspirador, Plácido the Conspiratory Poet. It hasn't been translated to English, needs to be translated to English. And she makes the argument that he was a conspirator and that he was not an innocent victim. So Plácido's identity throughout the history, his identity as a historical personage throughout the history of Cuban historiography, if I can say that, though it sounds a bit repetitive, and throughout the literary history, has been a figure who has been extraordinarily complex and been often debated. Some people said, look, the Spanish government made up the 1844 conspiracy. It didn't exist. And there was an excuse to take out what was an up-and-coming African-descended, middle class of sorts, or petite bourgeoisie. And others said, no, it did exist, and Plácido was involved. She makes the argument that he was involved. Her argument was very well received. Her book was award-winning in Cuba. And what I do in my book is I open up archives she was not able to tap into, archives here in the States, like the archive at Harvard. So I know his work is appreciated. I'm not sure if it's being taught in schools. One thing in Matanzas, you'll find statues to him, but outside of Matanzas, I don't find institutes named for him like you will for Jose Martí or Nicolás Guillén. So I still think that I would like to see the Cuban establishment, though it's not my country, not my culture, but I would like to see the Cuban establishment to acknowledge his contributions in a much greater way. Because he and a slew of other African-descended writers in the 19th century really, to me, anticipate what Cuban literature will become.
Very good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, we're getting close to the end of our hour. Would you like to tell us briefly about what you're working on now or what your next big project might be?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually am revising an article that compares a 19th century Black Cuban poem called The Cemetery on the Sugar Plantation by Jose de Carmen Diaz, published in 1879. It deals with a Congolese character, and it deals with the cemetery in a way that I think is evocative of Congolese notions about death. And so I'm comparing it with a letter that was written by the King of Congo in the 16th century. A letter where the King of Congo talks about what one might say the social death of enslaved people and the ways in which he is struggling with the Portuguese to get control of that trade. So that piece should be coming out hopefully this year.
Oh, great. Where should we look for that? Where can we look for that one?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Coming months.
The Afro-Hispanic Review.
Wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And especially congratulations on this book. I didn't show you before, but I have it here with me. And it really is a formidable contribution to the field. So I want to thank you for your work and thank you for joining us here today.
Absolutely.
The talk was really illuminating for me. And I think for a much broader audience than just scholars of the 19th century. We've had such a great attendance. I'm impressed with how many people joined us. So,
Wow.
Dr.
Thank you.
Petway, thank you one more time. We really appreciate your contributions.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I guess that's it.
Okay, that's wonderful. That is